Good morning, all. I think I would like to welcome you to the first session in the Transport and Climate Change Week 2022. We just had the opening, and we are starting with an event on Asia. And we all know that Asia is the region where a lot is happening in terms of transport and climate change. We only have 1 hour for this session, and we have a lot planned for this 1 hour. So I would like to start straight away, and I would like to start with introducing the panel that we have in this session. First, we have Marusha Kardama. Marusha is the Secretary General of the SLOCAT Partnership. And Marusha, can you also share your screen briefly to see that that you're there and that the camera is working?
I'm here, Cornie, and I believe that it's the colleagues in the back,
Excellent.
Technically, who can actually tell us who can be pinned for the video, but I'm here and I can see you and hear you loud and clear. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, from Brussels this morning. Then we also have Alok Jain. Alok is the CEO of Transport Consult in Hong Kong, and Alok is also a member of the Decarbonization Council for Asia, which is a major initiative in the context of transport and climate change, initiated by GIZ together with a number of other partners. Alok, are you there?
Yes, I'm very much here. I'm at least
excellent.
Visible to
then we look forward to a lot of stimulating. Yeah, and you to yourself is the beginning of all things, Alok. Yeah. But we can see you as well. Good. Then we also have Patrick Malejak, and Patrick is the Secretary General of PIARC. And PIARC, for those who do not know this, is the World Road Association. And maybe Patrick can also explain how World Road Association is abbreviated as PIARC. Patrick?
It's not abbreviated. Good morning, Cornie. Actually, it's not abbreviated. It's just a new name. There's a reason behind it. It used to mean Permanent International Association for Road Congresses, but with this, and that name would used to change in whatever language you were speaking at the time. So we've decided to fix it into PIARC for all languages. So it's like IBM, maybe a bit smaller.
Excellent. Yeah, and Patrick is calling in from Dakar, Senegal, where he is in a meeting on road asset management. And when we were testing the systems, the video was not very reliable. At the moment, it seems to be okay. So it might be that Patrick is going to voice only during the session. And then as the last presenter, we have Jamie Ladder from the Asian Development Bank. And Jamie is the Chief of the Transport Sector Group. Jamie, would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, Jamie Ladder, Chief of Transport Sector Group, as Cornie just said. Great pleasure to be here. The organization covers Asia and the Pacific, so everything across Central Asia through to the Pacific Islands. So a huge growth potential within the area. So a very important topic for discussion today. Thank you.
Yes, then let me share my screen. Very good. So the topic that we are discussing today it's a very simple question. Can Asia successfully implement the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals in the transport sector? And we are doing, when we were talking about a time frame, we're talking about initially about 2030, but as some of the panelists will explain, that 2050 is a relevant date as well. The session today consists of 4 parts, and each of the parts, at least the first 3 parts, will start with a few slides. And these are slides which are sourced from the Asian Transport Outlook, the ATO, which is a major new initiative in terms of knowledge management in the transport sector in Asia. Following these brief slides, we have a question for the audience, in which we are asking the audience to give their view. Then we will turn to the panelists, and the panelists will be asked to reflect on the topic of the segment that we are discussing, and they have received a guiding question for this as well. and they will be asked to reflect on the outcome of the poll as well. So in terms of the first round, if we look at how is Asia positioned vis-a-vis the global community when it comes to the SDGs and the Paris Agreement? If we look at this slide, and at the bottom you can see all the indicators which were used in composing these, and all of these indicators you can actually find in the Asian Transport Outlook database, and that you can find here at this location. If we start at the top, in terms of GDP in 2019, Asia had 49% of global GDP and it had 58% of the global population. On the basis of that, you would expect that Asia has roughly the same transport infrastructure. However, if we look at that, we see that this is not the case, that Asia only has 30% of the roads in the world, and Asia only has 34% of the heavy railways in the world. If we look at the travel, we also see that Asia does not have its due share of travel activity. In terms of passenger travel, Asia, while it has 58% of the population, only has 27% of the passenger travel and only 36% of the freight travel. If we look at it in terms of externalities, we see that in terms of air pollution, that Asia has 76%. In terms of road safety, Asia has 60%. We see that in terms of transport emission, in line with the reduced travel activity, it's only 31%. But so the key thing is that you could say that Asia is severely underrepresented in terms of transport infrastructure and transport activity. If we look at the policies, we see, because the policies could say like this guides us to a better world and to a better future. If we look at it, that the transport landscape in Asia is severely underdeveloped. We see that in many cases, like that 2/3 of the Asian countries do not have a transport policy which was enacted after 2015, when the SDGs were adopted and the Paris Agreement was adopted. And we see similar things when we look at logistics policies, road policies, rail policies. The good thing is that like if we look at the NDCs and the LTSs, we see that transport is fairly well represented, but in terms of policies, this is not the case. So that leads us to the first question for the audience. And this is a question which Gwen will now put on screen in the global platform, because to inform you, we are working with two platforms. We are working with Zoom for the panelists, and the participants are on a different platform. And there's a 30-second delay between that. So, and at the moment, I cannot see whether the question has been posted yet on the global platform. But the question is to the participants, if you would be a decision maker and you would need to allocate resources, where would you place these in terms of priority? Would you go for option A? I put 75% of my attention in the SDGs and only 25% in the Paris Agreement, because ultimately it's more important to have transport infrastructure and to have travel opportunities? Or is it that you say both are equally important? And as the third option, that you say, like, I would put 25% only in SDGs, and climate is really the overarching priority, and I put 75% of my resources and my efforts and my energy in the Paris Agreement. So that's the question for the participants. This will be on screen for about 60 seconds. And then after that, Gwen in Germany will tabulate the results, and she will share that in chat. But while the participants think about this, I would like to start with the panel, and this is a relatively short opening question, so you will have more time to give your views when we come in the rest of the segments. Shall we start in Africa? Patrick, where do you put your money in option A, B, or C? And I would like to hear from that. In your work in PR, is this really coming up as a dilemma for you as well, that you say, I need to focus on either the Paris Agreement or the SDGs?
Yeah, thank you, Cornie. And indeed, I'm currently in Africa just for a few days for a General Assembly of asset management funds, road asset management funds, and it's a really relevant question. I would say I would put my money on somewhere between A and B. I would say, in many cases, and you've presented very brilliantly the diagram for Asia. Some parts of the world really don't have enough infrastructure and don't offer transport services to their citizens that are compatible with SDGs. If you want to bring a little girl to school, if you want to bring a grandmother to the hospital, that usually requires transportation, especially from faraway villages. And there's no avoiding that. So what we're trying to do in the road sector and in our association, PIARC, the World Road Association, is establish recommendations for our members and how to address resilience issues. That's more adaptation than mitigation, very, very truly. And we're also working with the automobile sector so that they can find on roads infrastructure that will be compatible with the latest developments. So it's really a very topical question. Thank you, Cornie.
Thank you. So we have one between A and B. If we go from the bottom of the list on my screen, Jamie, where would you put yourself?
Difficult question because they're both so vitally important. So I think I would go for B to make sure that we're sharing it equally. And part of that is because it's not a simple fix. There isn't a button we can press and suddenly we will decarbonize all of transport, or there isn't a button we can press that was going to provide access for all or solve road safety issues. So I would say B, because we need to start now and we need to work on both of the components. Thank you, Cornie.
Yeah. But Jamie, like in your work, like ADB is spending about $4 to $6 billion a year on transport, and you're not spending this money on organization policies. You spend this money on building roads. So I would have gone straight for option A.
Next year, Asian Development Bank, along with all the other MDBs, will be aligned 100% in our sovereign support, aligned with the Paris Agreement. So actually, the real answer is probably 100% Paris Agreement and 75% SDGs. So, but unfortunately, we can't go beyond that 100% boundary. But the reality is, in all our assistance, every project must be aligned with the Paris Agreement. So in that case, it has to be 100% in all our support. But at the same time, we are addressing as many of the SDGs as possible. So all of our assistance is really looking at both components working together. But if you balanced it out, all projects must be Paris aligned or aligned with the Paris Agreement. But we will also be looking at, so yes, as Patrick said as well, accessibility, be that urban access or rural access, very important. Serious road safety issues. So a number of the SDGs that need to be addressed in addition to ensuring that we are aligned with the Paris Agreement too. So our work is really definitely on the climate change side, but equally where in all extent possible, looking at the SDGs.
Yes, Marusha.
Well, I think I would start.
Where do you position? Yeah, go ahead.
I think I would start with B, and then adjust. B because it represents that both are equally important for human development in a sustainability paradigm and for decarbonizing. But then, of course, the realities of each country are completely different. For us, from SlowCat, there's no such conundrum. In our name, we have sustainable low carbon transport because we were created precisely to break those silos and bring those two perspectives together. And also because for us, the transformation of transport systems is about addressing, if you want, a series of interconnected crises that are affecting Asia and actually are affecting us all worldwide. Is the climate, the air pollution, the resilience, and the equity crisis. In terms of the climate crisis, you've already shown some figures in terms of what are the CO2 emissions that are being experienced. If you take air pollution, we know that 4 of the world's 5 top most congested cities in the world are in Asia. That has got health impacts. If we talk about resilience, and actually not only to climate changes, but also to global shocks, we just need to take and see what the pandemic has meant, or accidents like the one of the Evergreen in the Suez Canal. All that has shown us the importance of transport in terms of not only moving essential workers, but also in this world of global supply chains. And then if you talk about equity, we know that equitable access to transport and mobility is very much at the backbone of equitable societies, because at the end of the day, it's all about access to services and jobs, whether we look at it in terms of the demographics of these urbanizing world and what it's meaning to leaving behind in many occasions rural areas, or when we talk about the risk of collapsing public transport systems and what would it be for equity. So for us, really, there's no such conundrum, but B perhaps is the answer, and then adapting progressively to the needs of every country.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that Marusha was referring to the mandate of Slow Cut. When we started Slow Cut something like 10 years ago, we met for 3 days in Bellagio, and we spent most of the time discussing whether we would be the low carbon transport partnership or whether we would be the sustainable transport partnership. And in the long run, we actually ended up becoming the sustainable low carbon transport partnership. But anyway, Alok, your position, where do you position yourself?
I'll take a slightly different spin to this, because the question fundamentally is built on a premise that these two things are mutually exclusive, which I don't think they are. There is a certain level of convergence between SDGs and Paris Agreement. I mean, there is no reason why SDGs goals can still be achieved, and at the same time putting Paris Agreement in the bang in the middle of that achievement. So I think this is exactly where the future development within Asia has to position, where we are pushing both the agendas, and I think they are both equally important as far as Asia is concerned. Your previous slide about infrastructure, and I think this is a discussion we had on social media a while before. I feel that it's a direct correlation between infrastructure and SDG is a bit of a linear thinking that we need to go away from. I mean, I live in Hong Kong, and I can tell you only 4% of Hong Kong land use is actually devoted to road infrastructure. It is probably lower than some of the underdeveloped cities in Asia. But would anybody call Hong Kong, a city that needs further development? No, 90% of the daily travel in Hong Kong is actually happening on public transport. This is a model city. So it is defining, sustainable goals or access to equal mobility or safe systems through just by looking at road length. I think is fundamentally, it's a hypothesis that we need to break away from. I feel that there are multiple solutions to reaching, as long as we know the final goal, then and I'm not saying that these are not important, but I'm just saying that we need to start thinking at a local level. Every city, every country, every region in Asia probably requires a different solution.
Thank you, Alok. And I think it's interesting, like what I'm seeing, and I would like to share with the participants the results of the poll. And we have a very nice equal distribution: 25% A, 50% B, and 25% C. So we are perfectly aligned. But I think that the big takeaway from this introductory round, which actually went 10 minutes longer than we had anticipated in our program, so we might have to only discuss the SDGs and skip the Paris Agreement altogether in the discussions. But what people are saying, and I think that that's one of the key takeaways, is that we need to adjust based on where we are. That the solution for Bhutan is not the same solution as for Bangladesh. For Bangladesh is not the same solution that if we talk about Hong Kong or the Pacific Islands. I saw that Patrick had raised his hand, and I suggest that he keeps his argument with him, and when we come to a good point in the subsequent discussion, that he brings that in. I would like to move to the next part, to the SDGs. For those of you who are not familiar with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in 2015, and the idea was that we want to have a global agenda for sustainable development. This followed on the Millennium Development Goals, which was done in the year 2000, which focused mostly on poverty alleviation, and then in the Sustainable Development Goals, this was broadened. The transport does not have its own SDG, notwithstanding the lobbying that we did for one, but what we do see is that there are a number of goals and targets which have transport relevance. And I'm just very quickly saying, like Sustainable Development Goal 9, which is about infrastructure development, but this also has targets and indicators which are related to transport activity. In general, the SDGs say we need more transport activity, we need more passenger travel, and we need more freight travel in Asia or in the world than what we have now. So more travel is good, according to the SDGs. And what I already flagged is that if you are an Asian person, you would travel on average 4,500 kilometers annually. If you are a global citizen, you would travel about 6,500 kilometers. So this is a repeat of what I said before. If we look at the rural access, the people living in the rural area, there is a very clear goal in the SDGs. It says that everybody who lives in a rural area should live within 2 kilometers of an all-season road. And this is to access markets, this is to access health, education and things like. The reality is that in Asia, only that there are 560 million people who do not live within this distance from an all-season road. And so that they have troubles accessing markets, etc. All of it documented in detail in the Asian Transport Outlook, because if I don't mention the Asian Transport Outlook every second slide, I get messages from my team members who say, you promised us that you would promote the ATO. And what I would like to do is also to promote the ATO team, who are also listening into this call, and that is Sudhir. I think most of you know Sudhir Gota. In addition to that, we have young promising researchers, Mel in the Philippines, who is going to make a very good vote in the presidential elections in the Philippines after this call. We have Adwaid from India, and we have Urva. Urva is from Pakistan, but based in Japan. So and all of these slides, all of this information that I'm presenting is collected by them, is analyzed by them. So a big round of applause for the ATO team. Yeah. Then urban access. The idea is that people would have access to good public transport. The reality is that in Asia, that 1.3 billion of the urban residents do currently not have this access to modern forms of public transport. And unfortunately, Alok, speaking from Hong Kong, has a different reality than, for example, like Adwaid calling in from India, or Mel calling in from the Philippines. Then there is in the SDGs, there is also a very clear target on road safety. We want to halve the number of people dying from traffic accidents. At the moment, 690,000 people die annually in Asia due to fatal road crashes. So then one of the reports that we put together in the ATO, which is the status of transport-related SDGs. Green means good progress, orange means that there is some momentum being built. We are not yet meeting the goals, we are doing poorly. So if you look at it, we only have a few greens and we have a lot of oranges and we have a lot of reds. So it means that there's a very large agenda for us. Unlike the Paris Agreement, where we have 2050 often as a target, in SDGs we have 2030 as a target. If we look at the policies, we have looked at the policies. The ATO also has 460 trans policies in Asia. Having read all of those policies, we only could find one green that we say like that in terms of policies that there is good progress, and that is only on road safety. All the others, we think that in terms of coverage and in terms of ambition, that policies are not ambitious enough, and that these stated policies, as they are currently documented, that they will not lead to the implementation of the transport-related SDG targets in Asia. And we have listed on the left the topics. So that leaves us to the next question, and then the panelists here the panelists will be asked to talk specifically about SDGs and not about Paris Agreement. That's coming the next segment. So the question is, how likely is it that we'll meet the 2030 SDGs with respect to rural access, urban access, and road safety? And here you can choose the following options. You can say regress in at least one, progress in 1 to 2, progress in all, and achieve at least one target or achieve all the 3 targets by 2030. Urban access, rural access, and road safety. I hope that Gwen is posting this, and we will follow the same process as that we did with the previous round. The panelists will be asked to say where they position themselves, and at the end, and they can give a little bit of elaboration, and then after that, we will reveal the results at the end. So this time we will start at the top. Alok, what do you think? How far down the ladder are you going from A to E by 2030?
I think I'll go for C, because there is a growing recognition, I think all across Asia, that something needs to be done, and Asia is falling behind. I think, honestly speaking, this would be, in my opinion, would be Asia's century. There will be a lot more work that will be happening. Half the world's population lives in Asia, so obviously, there will be, this will be and the economic growth is finally coming. China is pulling its weight. So we are seeing a lot more action happening on the Asian front. So, and if you see, even going back to your first slide, although on the road side, Asia was only 27% of the global number, on HSR, high-speed rail, Asia was almost 76% of the global number. So you see the whole swing there. So Asia has been doing some good work in those respects. Metros, Asia is again on that slide, metro is 59%. So against this population of 58%. So I think there is a good balance which is happening. And again, I would say that we may not need to box ourselves into mere numbers here. I completely agree that we need to provide rural access, we need to improve the urban congestion and etc. But those are not the only way to achieve a development goal. That's my view.
Okay. Marusha, where do you position yourself?
I agree with Alok. To me, C. I think that the awareness about the issues at stake and how they are interlinked is as bigger as ever. And perhaps that, if any, could be the main achievement of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. And I actually, building upon what Alok has said, I would argue that the question of whether transport will contribute to the SDGs and whether transport would be a vector of sustainable human development will not be only about the growth in infrastructure, in vehicles and in transport activity. We recall the 2030 agenda is about these interconnected needs, and it's about how progress in one goal and its targets will help you actually make progress in another goal and its respective targets. I invite you to take a look at this look at wheel on transport and the SDGs that tries to precisely show how transport is connected to the different SDGs and can enable them. I think also implicit in what we've got here, it will be interesting to define a bit what we mean by infrastructure, isn't it? And make sure that we don't demonize all types of infrastructure. For instance, roads, good roads can do a ton to actually vertebrate the human development of a country, not only by giving access to mobility, but also to in many instances, giving connectivity to other utilities. And of course, in roads and in road infrastructure, we can also see public transport, and we can also see tactical urbanism for walking and cycling, for instance. We might also want to define a bit the types of vehicles we need to use, isn't it, to in order to be able to keep on improving human development in Asia. More vehicles dedicated to public transport are needed. We are seeing as well how 2- and 3-wheelers in Asia are actually changing the face of mobility in Asian cities, and actually how Asian cities are accessing energy, because we are seeing the electrification on 2- and 3-wheelers at a scale and at a speed that we are not seeing anywhere else in the globe. Certainly, what we do not need is more private motorization. And if I then have the opportunity, I would be happy to perhaps illustrate it with a bit more figures to share with colleagues what do I mean by that.
Thank you very much. So what Alok and Marusha, they are quite aspirational in their statements, and that they say like we trust and we expect that things will happen. But like one of the values I would say of the Asian transport outlook is that we would say statistics do not lie. Although sometimes statistics can be used to underpin lies, but if you look at the AGO, we see that the trend in Asia actually is that we see a move away from, for example, from railways towards road. We see that the relative share of rail is decreasing. So in a way, the trends on the ground are actually moving towards unsustainability, because also, if we look at the relationship between private and public transport in Asia, we also see that public transport is not really gaining sufficient in share in order to compensate all of this. I see that Alok has raised his hand, so this was a very devious tactic of mine, Alok, is to first have you speak and then make my point. I would like to first go to Jamie and to Patrick. And if they are short enough, then we have time to come back to you as well, Alok. Yeah, Jamie.
Thank you, Cornie. I just wanted to very quickly refer back to your slide 13, because the bottom part, the three red ones, which are the SDG 911, 11.2, and 3.6, so those highlighted in this question, those are the ones that transport has the most direct impact in, but those are the ones that were shown up as red. Where transport has a collaborative or a cross-cutting issue with other sectors, it shows that more progress is being made. So the bottom three here, these are pure transport. It's road safety, it's equitable access, rural access, urban access, very much transport focused. Those above linked very closely with energy sector and a whole range of other cross-cutting. I do worry why transport, in the way we've assessed this, is performing less well than those where we're looking at other sectors or a combination of sectors within there. But coming back to the question, I think progress will be made, but if we're looking at statistics, as you mentioned, I'm afraid I'm going to have to go with B, that I think progress will be made in two of them. But in reality, I think progress will be made in all three. But the reason I'm saying two is because of what you mentioned in terms of demand for travel is relatively low in Asia, but that demand will certainly increase as the economies grows, and that both the need to shift goods and the demand for passenger movements will increase. With that, it's likely to see an increase in the short to medium terms in terms of road safety. So while I believe progress is being made and will be made in road safety, I think the absolute numbers will actually go in the wrong direction in absolute terms, because the demand for travel will increase, and therefore, unfortunately, we will see an increase in the road fatalities across the region and also in serious injuries. But it's not all bad news. Us, with a number of governments across the region and development partners, have established the Asia Pacific Road Safety Observatory, which is very much looking at improving road safety transport data, analyzing that data, and much more importantly, looking at what policies and what actions should be used to implement the safe system approach to make sure that the number of fatalities and serious injuries are reduced. So progress is being made, but I do fear it will increase in absolute terms before we see a decrease. And one final point, because of the time frame, 2030, what we're also a little bit worried about is what will be the priorities and what has happened across the world and is happening across the world over the last 2 years, and what this may impact in terms of financial resources that are available to governments across the Asian region to address these issues. Coming out of COVID, obviously significant impacts on how those economies have performed. There's inflationary pressures across the region as well. So we are seeing significant debt issues also raising in a number of our member countries. So I do, a little progress was being made. I do fear that that progress may slow down as a result of COVID, as a result of what is happening in Eastern Europe and the inflationary pressures that's putting around the world, but also some of the debt that is being experienced across the region as a result of both of those. So while we were seeing progress, unfortunately, that progress may slow down, but definitely progress is being made, particularly in the accessibility. I do fear that road safety progress is made, but absolute numbers are increasing because the demand for travel is increasing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then before we go to Patrick, a very small glance in the ATO kitchen. I think that Jamie mentioned the issue of debt. So one of the things that we are becoming increasingly aware of in the ATO is that we say, like, it's important to have global targets, a global consensus, as what we see in the SDGs. It's important to subsequently have the policy in place. And we say we put a lot of question marks in terms of currently the policies, but more importantly is also the funding, because if you don't have the funding organized to actually build the public transport systems, to put into the road safety schemes and things like that. And this is something where we also see a lot of problems emerging in Asia. But this is something where the ATO will focus on in the near future. Patrick, you have heard from the three other panelists. And so the general consensus is that nobody has gone beyond C. So are you brave enough to venture into the unknown and say that we will achieve at least one target, or that we will achieve all targets, or are you aligning yourself with the other panelists?
Thank you, Cornie. I think this is where I have to defer to the statisticians in the room, and I'm not one of them. And my crystal ball is a bit rusty. Really good question, and I would tend to side with Jamie here. There will be progress in one or two. It's a question of how we define indicators, and in SDGs, it's really great that countries at the United Nations were able to agree on indicators. This is how you make progress. This is how you measure things. And at the ATO, I'm quite convinced that you know this better than everyone else. But indicators, like the first one, proportion of rural population within 2 kilometers of an all-season road. Okay, that's a measurable indicator somehow. But of course, I think everyone would agree that this is an imperfect indicator. The proper indication would be access to transport services, but this is much more difficult to measure. So if we want to be able to give guidance to countries and to cities and to operators, we need such tools, even though they're not perfect. I would digress for a second and talk about address road safety. Indicator 3.6 is, of course, quite ambitious, but I think we've been able collectively as a planet, I would say, to agree on the second decade of action. Well, on one side, you would say we did a second decade because the first one did not really succeed. But we were able to agree on the second one because everyone's convinced that this is extremely relevant. And road safety, from our contacts here in PIAC members, 125 member governments, as well as operators and industries, road safety is a very important topic for everyone. So in this state of mind, I'm quite sure that we will make huge steps towards such objectives. If I go back to what Alok said earlier, no size fits all. And countries are different and cities are different. And this is really very, very important. Every country, every operator will need to, or does need already, to make the right decisions and to plan ahead, which is not easy, because in some cases decisions are just made on the ground with no planning. So this will be one of the key messages that I would like to share with the audience today, to encourage whoever is in charge to plan ahead and to dialogue with transport users and transport operators so as to reach a consensus, sometimes an easy one if we want to reach the Paris Agreement goals. So that we know where we're going. But I remain optimistic. You have a question on next slide, I guess, about the role of roads and in passenger and freight transport. Well, we'll see. And as Marusha said, it's not a good idea to demonize any transport mode. And in many cases, roads are easy to build, easy to maintain, easy to operate. That's just a fact. It doesn't mean that roads are better than other modes of transportation, but it must be for some reason that we don't say in 9.1.1 that rural population has to live within 2 kilometers of an all-season railway. There must be a reason behind that. And roads are essential for public transport, for example. Buses drive on roads, and even some urban areas. Please go ahead.
Patrick, I think that you've started to repeat the arguments that you made in the first round, so that in respect of let's say of time, I would like to move on. I will give Alok the final say in this segment, but first I would like to present the results of this. There is nobody of the people who voted who is pessimistic, who says that we will regress in at least one. There were 21% who said that we have progress in one or two. 64% reflected more or less what was being said in the panel, so progress in all. But I think that the weakness that we made in drafting the survey is that we did not define progress sufficiently. And then there's 14% who says that we will achieve at least one target. So a very brief final word before we move to the Paris Agreement, Alok.
Yeah, well, just a quick rejoinder to something that you mentioned about railways market share decreasing in Asia from ATO numbers. What I would like to point out is that both railways and roads are actually increasing in Asia. It's just that the growth in road is higher than the growth in railway. Hence, the railways are looking decreasing, but they're not actually decreasing.
No, thank you, Alok. If we would have, let's say, till 2030 time tonight to talk about this, we could actually show you that there are actually countries in Asia where the railways are physically shrinking. Yeah. So and we don't see that with roads. Roads grow everywhere, but railways, I think that if we look at, there are 30 railway economies, and I think that there are something like 10 of those that the railway network is actually becoming smaller in size. But the point is well taken from Alok, is that we have growth in both. Now I need to move to my. So in terms of the Paris Agreement, these kinds of slides, I think that we have seen them all. The way that we often explain it, that we say is that transport is the fastest growing sector in the economy globally, and transport in Asia is growing faster than other parts in the world. And that is what you see on the left-hand side, where you have the comparison within Asia, and then on the right we see that we have the situation of Asia versus the rest of the world. And if we see that Asia is transport emissions are growing faster than other parts of the world. This is what we call our hopeful slide. And this is a slide that Sudhir came up with after an awful lot of number crunching. And there is a similar companion slide for the global level. But the storyline here is relatively simple. Like if we look at traditional business as usual, we saw a situation that we would see emissions of 8 gigaton by 2050 if we would not do anything. But these are business as usual studies which were actually carried out before 2013. If you look at more recent business as usual studies, we see that the world is not going to be as bleak, as somber as we had anticipated before the Paris Agreement. And we see actually, let's say, a business as usual by 2050 of 4.2 gigaton. And The reality is, like, if you do the modeling and then we say, like, what would a 1.5 degree target look like in the context of Asia, then it means, this is where we become a little bit pessimistic and more somber again, is that we say we need to go to half a gigaton. So it's quite a nuanced picture. Like, the world is changing. And this leads to a lot of discussions in the HO team about being half full, half empty, whether it's filling up or whether it's more empty and things like that. But you can see that the situation is changing. So, and the question now is, like, are we able to bridge the gap between the new business as usual of 4.2 and where we need to be in 0.5? In terms of policies, within the HO, we are looking, of course, as everybody else is doing, at the long-term strategies. We are looking at the nationally determined contributions. And there we see that transport, in terms of coverage and ambition, we see that this is either, let's say, in the middle, or in some cases we say like, that we see some very good examples. And what we have done here is we have also tried to differentiate between the high income and the upper middle income and the lower income countries. But the reality is that transport investments are not made on the basis of NDCs. They are being made on the basis of transport policies, on transport investment plans, on the basis of real policies. And there we see that what we also mentioned at the beginning is that we see in many cases the policy framework in countries is not really fully up to date. Either countries do not have a transport policy, or it's an old transport policy. And even countries who have adopted a transport policy after 2015, we see that there is a disconnect between what the country is saying in its NDC or in its LTS, or what it is saying in its transport policy. Obviously, there are good examples as well. We are also somewhat dramatizing the discussion here, but what we want to emphasize, and this is one point that we're putting a lot of emphasis on in the ATO, is the linkage between NDCs and other transport policies. So without further ado, let's move to the key question. And this question is not about 2050. This question is about 2030. And so we are not asking whether Asia will be able to get down to the 0 point. We think this question is too far in the future. The question here is very simple: be able to peak its transport emissions. And the question here, the answers are not at all, not likely, somewhat likely, very likely, or absolutely achievable. Peaking of transport emissions by 2030. So who would like to go? Need to looking at the questions as if you know the answer already. Marusha, can you hear me?
We had a breakdown, Cornie. We couldn't hear you for a bit.
Okay, so that was the 10-second problem from my side. Marusha, do you know the answer?
I love it, Cornie, when you want to put us on the spotlight and then do your game. Look, if we look at figures, we know very well that things are not looking in the very right direction. I think that we're also having difficulty in projecting how the pandemic is really going to affect. And there is a big aspect that I don't think we have even mentioned here, that we don't even know how it's going to affect us, which is that just a couple of months ago, as we know, Russia invaded Ukraine, and the conversation about fossil fuels has become as bigger as we've ever seen it, perhaps over the past decades. And I think that we should bear that in mind. For instance, when we look at what the International Agency for Energy produced just 1 month after the invasion, was 10 points on how to cut oil use, and 9 out of the 10 are about transport. So I think that we have to factor that in as well, because it will be significant, that conversation in terms of emissions and in terms of what countries do. Now, where are we going? I think that nevertheless, I would like to leave a rather positive message here, understanding as well that we only have got a few minutes to left, and that probably this is my last intervention. I think that we will be able to support a peak if we really look at things in a systemic, integrated and intermodal manner. And if we link the transformation of transport systems in the region to the wider societal and economic transformations that are occurring. For instance, if we take the local economy, that could mean better integration between land planning and transport planning. For instance, the idea of local shops, so that notion of the 15-minute city that is so popular in many European cities. If we look at the economic trend of digitalization and dematerialization, it'll be extremely interesting to monitor how in-home services like healthcare, administrative services, or banking are going to affect the demand of transport, for instance. If we look at the shared economy, I think it'll be very interesting to see how, as we come out from the pandemic and the lessons learned, we're going to be providing stable business models for operators of shared fleets of 2 and 3 wheelers or even of cars in Asia. And also, I think it'll be extremely interesting to see as we evolve in this fossil fuel situation that we are living through the Ukrainian and Russian conflict. It'll be very interesting to see how we put the electrification of mobility and transport at the service of intermodality, how we actually boost combined electrified freight and road freight, for instance, for long distances, particularly until we see reliable solutions for long distance freight in aviation and in shipping. So I think that there is an opportunity there if we really apply the broad shift and improve. And a last beacon of hope that I would like to leave is that besides the figures that we are learning here, thanks to the efforts of the ATO, we would also need to bear in mind perhaps the efforts in national urban mobility plans and sustainable urban mobility plans that are being led, for instance, by the Mobilize Your City partnership. And I think that when we look at the NAMP of the Philippines or the SAMPs in different Asian cities like Ahmedabad in India or Medan in Indonesia, there's very interesting figures there about how those SAMP efforts are actually reducing. Just let me finish my sentence 1 second. How those SAMPs really allow to reduce CO2 emissions and deaths, and actually how they multiply access to public transport. So there's hope there. Peaking will not occur in 2030. Will we have the right direction? I think we will. Open questions out there.
So thank you, Marusha. And sorry, because I'm under strict instructions to end at 9 o'clock. So Marusha is positioning us somewhat positively. So I would guess somewhere between C and D. Jamie, what do you think?
I didn't exactly say that, but I will have to accept the interpretation in the strict time constraints.
Okay.
I would say B, not likely. However, I am very optimistic that net zero emissions in the transport sector and full decarbonization of transport will happen. Absolutely, it will happen. But the time frame, again, is the critical issue. We are seeing already Asia lead in e-vehicles. Well over 95% of global e-vehicles are in Asia when we look at all vehicle types, particularly the 2 and the 3 wheelers. Individual choices has a significant role to play, as does, and based on that is the business model or the family business model. At the moment, if you incorporate the capital cost and the operating cost, it is more cost effective in most Asian economies to buy an electric 2 or 3 wheeler than it is to buy an internal combustion engine 2 or 3 wheeler. In most Asian cities, it is more effective or business case to purchase e-buses or e-taxis because the operating costs are significantly lower than combustion engines, despite the higher purchase cost, the capital cost outlay. So already we're seeing that tipping point for certain types of vehicles in certain locations. And I think that will accelerate. The reason I'm saying B, not likely, it's the time frame. We're not just talking about new vehicles. We're not just saying someone who is going today to purchase that taxi, that bus, that motorbike. We're also talking about in-use vehicles that will probably last 30 years. Those are already on the road. To try and do a cash for clunkers or buy out those huge vehicle fleets is highly unlikely. The amount of money required is just staggering to purchase all currently in use vehicles on the road, and it's very difficult to switch those. And final point, I know we're running short of time, making sure we look at all sectors, different modes of transport, shifting from diesel to electrification or hydrogen of the railway systems, in maritime, looking at the increase in hydrogen or ammonia, and the very tricky one, aviation, clearly a specialist field, a limited number of manufacturers in that subsector. How will the different fuel sources in the aviation sector take off? So positive in we will see full-scale decarbonization in the sector. The key question is the time frame, given what is currently in use and how we can set policies for that pathway for new vehicles and ultimately to phase out the older vehicles. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. So after hearing from Marussia about the context in which climate policy needs to be seen in the coming days, like we are starting, and let's say the positive reference to sums and nums, that what we are seeing from Jamie is also some, let's say that he says like there are a lot of indications or green shoots which show that at some point that we are moving in the right direction. So before moving to Patrick, you will come as the last in this segment. Alok, you come now.
Hey, well, I'll go with B as well, it's only for one reason. And I am an optimistic person, and as Jamie, I align with Jamie and Marussia what they said, but I still say B only for one reason, because China and India at the moment, the trajectory that they are projecting, which are really the 2 billion people out of 3 billion people in Asia, they have not set 2030 as the peak. So possibly 2030 may not be the peaking point because of this reason. But we are seeing pockets of hope. And and again, Hong Kong, I was just recently, just a couple of weeks ago, one of the world's first commercial launch of an e-bus operation by on a net cost model happened in Hong Kong, which is really a milestone in my opinion. And I think that is, we are going to see more and more in India. Recently, the tender that they did for electric bus operation was like 45 rupees per kilometer, which is, even if you asked me before the tender, I would have said it's a ridiculous number. And at that kind of a rate, if you scrap all India buses and start from zero today and replace it with electric bus fleet, I think 40% of the Indian cities, the buses will make money by themselves. So I think these are just great numbers which we are seeing that are coming in the market. But other thing that I would like to mention, that the speed of this change is currently impacted by access to finance. And that is really in a short supply in Asia. And I think that conundrum of finance, I know development banks are doing a lot of things, but the green bond market, the green finance market is still very underdeveloped in Asian countries. And there needs to be a huge impetus given to the access to finance aspects in Asia to drive that change. And I think if it's not 2030, maybe 2035, maybe 2040, but yes, we are moving in the right direction and things are changing. There are pockets of hope there.
Excellent. Patrick.
Yeah, thank you, Cornie. I will try and not repeat what has been said before. Yeah, I would say not likely, even though I tend to be optimistic. The reason I say that is the diagram you showed just before, highlighting that policy frameworks are usually currently not really in place. And we've seen examples that business cases make a lot of sense and really push electric vehicles in where we want them to be. That's great, that's wonderful. And we also see that the context of the COVID crisis has developed work from home patterns. That's great as well. But we also see a sharp increase in home deliveries, instant home deliveries, which mean that there's a higher demand for transportation, at least in urban areas and between freight centers and demand centers. So if we don't have policy frameworks in place to try and smooth this out, I'm not able to say that we're going to be very optimistic. One last remark, though, is that we are seeing improvements in the tools that are being offered to transport operators and decision makers. I'm thinking of HTM4, which we're now improving to include such considerations as climate change in all its dimensions, for example, and it will be available in a couple of years and will be really, really a great help. Or software such as the source system, which also helps investments being made, taking into account all these considerations. So B as well, but I keep my fingers crossed. Thank you.
Thank you. So, like, if I very briefly summarize, is that I found a lot more optimism when we were discussing the segment on the Paris Agreement than when we were discussing the segment on the SDGs. What people are saying is that there is a lot of good things happening, but it needs to be scaled up through policy so that we scale up the impact. And in order to make these green shoots actually mature, I think that finance will be a key question, that this is a challenge. My suggestion would be that we had another question on listening to this discussion, whether your overall perspective has changed. I would suggest that each of the participants keeps these questions in mind. And there is actually, apart from this 1 hour, we have actually 5 days of discussions. Both at the global level and at the regional level, and keep this in mind. And let's see that we hope then that by the end that we will avoid that people respond option C, that the discussion has left them more confused. I think that in general, listening to the discussions today, I think we are probably somewhere between A and B. Like, so I think that we are very much aware of the challenges ahead of us, but at the same time, each of us, from our own perspective, that we see very hopeful signs, and that we say, like, if we would have had this discussion 10 years ago, we would have had a radically different discussion, because the examples would no longer be the same. So with that, I would like to hand back to the organizers in Germany. For those of you who are interested in really number crunching and who are going to take part in the training course provided by the Regional Cooperation Center of UNFCCC on baseline formulation, please refresh your screen if you're in the global on the global platform. For those of you who will be in further discussions, I hope to see all of you in Berlin on Thursday. Otherwise, for those of you who will be in Leipzig next week for the International Transport Forum, I look forward to meeting you there and to continue these discussions. And I look forward also to further stimulating exchanges with Alok on Twitter on, let's say, on whether Asia is on the right track or not. With that, please do come to us if you have questions on the Asian transport outlook. We are always happy to answer it. And mostly if people ask us something, we have some information on that. With that, thank you very much to GIZ for hosting us with this event. And please do attend all the other sessions of Transport Week this week. And you can find those, and you can find further information on that at transportweek.org. Yeah. With that, thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.